We are really looking forward to this talk today from Dan Nickolai. It was about a year ago that we had a webinar. I forget what it was on, but part of our conversation went towards placement testing, and somebody said, we need a webinar on placement testing, and Dan would be the perfect person to do it. So thanks so much, Dan, for answering that call when we asked, would you be willing to do something on placement testing? Also want to just let everyone know that IALLT has a conference coming up. It's always my absolute favorite conference. It's going to be at the end of the month in Moorhead, Minnesota. So if you need a place to go later this month, definitely consider coming to our conference. So thanks so much, Dan, for being here today and talking to us about curriculum-centered language placement testing.
Thank you so much. Let's just go ahead and get started. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Hopefully this works this time. Does that look good? Okay.
Looks good, looks good.
Okay, great. So today I am going to be talking about curriculum-centered, and I have a little asterisk there. I'll explain that in a second. Curriculum-centered language placement testing with SLUPE. And it may surprise some of you, but this is not actually the standard approach to placement testing. Most language placement tests are not actually centered around a curriculum. And I had the asterisk here, curriculum-centered, because in the testing literature, curriculum-centered is often seen labeled as a criterion reference test, which is in contrast to a norm reference test. So criterion reference test, I'll be calling this the CRT throughout the presentation, and NRT, which is norm reference test. And I want to talk a little bit about these terms and how they're seen in the testing literature. So the big difference with a criterion reference test or a curriculum-centered test is that student tests are weighed against well-defined objectives. The curriculum, the syllabus, syllabi, course goals, articulation, which of course we all have for our courses as language teachers. Let me advance here. And this contrast to the norm reference tests, so they're not designed to kind of compare the test takers. So like with the SAT or the ACT or the GRE or any one of these like higher stakes tests that are used for admissions decisions or scholarship decisions, these tests are calibrated in a way where they're trying to find, the percentiles of students, so the top 5%, for example. If you're trying to do that with a test, then yeah, a norm reference test is great and is well suited for that purpose. With a criterion reference test, it's kind of are you measuring? You want to measure mastery versus non-mastery. Can you do something? To give you an example, your driver's test could be considered a criterion reference test, right? Can you safely drive this vehicle? If you can, then you've passed the test, right? You're not looking for the top 5% best drivers there are out there. Maybe we should do it that way. I don't know. We have fewer accidents for sure. But with a criterion reference test, your test items or your questions, they're not meant to discriminate between high achieving and low achieving. You just want to know, for example, like, does the student use the preterite test or use the preterite tense consistently well? And if they do, what does that mean when we're trying to decide a point of entry into our language program? So statistically, this means you won't necessarily have a normal distribution where you have like a bell curve that's perfect and beautiful and half the students get something wrong and half of them get it right. It's not really the point of a criterion reference test. What it does demonstrate, and which a norm reference test, or an NRT, does not demonstrate, is how much of the course content is known by the student. And that's really the goal. Now, there are several problems with NRTs, or the norm reference tests, tests like the GRE, the SAT. Brown and Hudson, in their book, suggest the following. There are always going to be teaching and testing mismatches. What's being tested is not necessarily what has been taught. Again, think about the SAT, ACT, GRE, where what you see on that test is not necessarily what you saw in a high school curriculum, for example. And in addition to that, there's a lack of instructional sensitivity to these instruments like the GRE. Whereas if you have an NRT or a norm reference test and you spend, say, a semester or 2 semesters with content and instruction, after those 2 semesters, your test score might not necessarily change or change very little. contrast to a CRT, where hopefully the test score will be dramatically different. And often in these tests, I see this a lot in placement tests too, is the lack of curricular relevance. Things that are put onto the test don't necessarily have anything to do with what you've been, what you hope to cover in a language course. Again, statistically, you're kind of restricted to the normal distribution, which, you know, in my opinion, is really artificial when it comes to deciding what course a student should be in. And restriction to items that discriminate. Now, what I mean by this, and this is kind of maybe a more technical testing term, you could put a really obscure vocabulary item, for example, on a placement test, and yeah, only the very best students will get that right. But again, maybe it has no curricular relevance. Maybe it doesn't really tell you much other than the student has a really large vocabulary, but it's not, you know, hitting a check mark, like, oh yeah, this is what we cover in Spanish 101, for example. So I set out to design a new kind of paradigm for placement testing. And I had a few things in mind. My first objective, which was modest, was to put students in the right course. Prior to developing the SLUPE, we had an NRT that was very good, actually, at deciding which students belonged in a 101 course and which students could be eligible for testing out of the language curriculum. But they didn't discriminate very well. They couldn't discern at the intermediate, low intermediate, high intermediate level. And so we always had a lot of re-registration problems due to the instrument we were using. And I wanted a test that aligned to the objectives that we had set in our language program. Another goal from all of our faculty here at St. Louis University, excuse me, was to create a test that would adapt, so we wouldn't have to, you know, serially give out, like, you know, this assessment and this assessment and this assessment to get to the level for a student. So we wanted something that would adapt automatically based on previous responses. So as a student answers the 101 questions well, the test will deliver slightly more difficult questions and go backwards as well if it needs to. Another thing that our previous placement test didn't do was measure multiple competencies. There was no real reading comprehension, excuse me, or listening comprehension. It was just a lot of kind of discrete point, grammatical discrete point questions, multiple choice. So I wanted to incorporate that into our test as well. And of course, here we wanted to make sure that we didn't have to do anything, that we didn't need any human intervention when reviewing these tests. So the scoring mechanism had to be automatic and instant. So no human review of reading student essays or having questions that were too open-ended, or at the time, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. At the time, there was no real good way to do a speech sampling that was automatic. Another goal was to take all this data that we collected from the student test takers and use it to inform our curriculum and to inform revisions to the test itself. So the SLUPE administrative interface, and now understand that, like many of you, I have a lot of faculty I support who aren't super tech savvy. So I wanted to create, excuse me, wanted to create something that focused on simplicity, so I could actually have colleagues contribute test content. And I also wanted to focus on inter-institutional collaboration. So, you know, if I have a colleague or a peer at another institution who has a Vietnamese program, and then I need a Vietnamese program, maybe we could contribute questions together into the same testing engine, and I can use their ideas, they could use my ideas. So collaboration was kind of built in from the beginning. Another thing that we wanted to do was to kind of incorporate data analysis into the tool itself. So we could see, you know, which questions tend to give us a lot of information, which questions didn't give us so much information, and to do this kind of quickly and intuitively for not just for myself, but for other contributing faculty. The SLUPE student interface, the questions appear like this. They start with multiple choice questions. And this is just a vocabulary item, verb infinitives, vocabulary choice, and for a Portuguese question. And this is the standard format for a lot of the questions. So they go through and they click this. Excuse me so much. The second part of the test, it moves from the multiple choice questions to listening comprehension. And these questions can be video or audio. And so the student will listen to an audio clip or watch a video, and they'll see 5 true or false statements, and they'll check the ones that correspond to what they heard. Another kind of different thing about the criterion referenced approach is if you look down here, and I'm going to try to use the annotation tool. Let's see here. Oh yeah, neat. So if you look down here, in addition to seeing where a student placed, you have a listening comprehension score and semester breakdowns. So I did this right before we started recording for the webinar. My Portuguese isn't very good. I got a 30% listening comprehension score. Out of all the semester 1 questions I was asked, I got 75% right. But semester 2 questions, I didn't get any right. And because I didn't get any semester 2 questions right, I was never prompted with the more advanced questions. Okay, moving on. Oh, and I gotta escape out of this. Okay. Oh, how do I clear my annotations? Clear my drawing. Okay, creating this test, actually we learned a lot of lessons going through this process, which started in 2010. One of the most, let's see here. One of the most surprising lessons is that we didn't have great intuition about which questions were going to be good indicators of placement. So like in French, we have this example with the partitive article where we have the sentence, Pierre buys bread, or Pierre buys some bread. Your American student learning French, or most other students learning French, they'll routinely forget the du in this sentence. It'll say something like Pierre achète pain. But the du is required in the structure. And they see this in French 101, 102, 103, forever. It's the most common construction in the French language. If you pick up a frequency dictionary, you can't avoid the partitive article. It's like the 5th most common construction in French. But as common as it is, even our advanced students routinely mess it up. So it just proves to be an example of questions that we thought, because they were part of the curriculum, would be answerable by students taking our classes, which turned out not to be true. The do, if you're a Bill Van Patten fan, is a non-lexical item, right, or a non-content word, sorry. And then we had other examples like the masculine adjective variant in French. Usually in French, you have a masculine and a feminine version of an adjective, but there's some exceptions to that. So this one was routinely missed, even by advanced students. So these questions were answered incorrectly across the board, even though they had been introduced in our courses. And, not just introduced one time, but over and over again. So in addition, many other items that we wrote seem to poorly measure the gains made by our students. Here's a quote from an early CRT advocate, Cartier. He says, "These tests are much more difficult to devise and administer, but the additional time and effort is easily justified by the reliability and validity of the information they provide about student ability." Which is true, because when you have something like a curriculum-centered test or a criterion reference test, when you look at the scores, you're like, oh, okay, I know that this student has the ability to use the subjunctive at this level. Excuse me. So we spent a long time looking at the data that we got from the student responses, and they started to paint this picture about which items were being answered correctly at what point in the curriculum. Some of these items gave us no information, like the partitive or the belle example, the adjective. And other items were problematic because they showed a regression on certain grammatical points, like students started over-relying on the subjunctive. But we kind of looked at everything. We decided, okay, some of these things, like the partitive or the masculine variant of beau, they're not deal breakers for a given placement of the course. So what we decided to do was to use the student data, look at the data and look at the curriculum and see where the matches were to decide what is being learned in these classes. So we ended up with a hybrid model, which is a data-informed CRT. So it's curriculum-based, but data-informed. And Lynch and Davidson have suggested in the past that a clear dichotomy between NRTs and CRTs may not even exist. So maybe most tests fall between a CRT and NRT. Brown and Hudson in their book on criterion referenced language testing say a truly CRT placement test is in the theoretical realm. But the way we have our kind of hybrid model designed, it's like we can allow our deal breakers to remain and other questions can be refined to kind of reflect the incremental advances that we know are occurring in the classes. Results to date, we do calibration on our tests periodically if we change textbooks or our student population changes too over time. So we look at the data quite frequently to see if questions are still pertinent. Kind of some longitudinal studies that we've done here suggest that the SLUPE recommendations have been more reliable than the previous assessment tool, less re-registration. Some of our faculty have concerns about the zone of proximal development, Vygotsky's idea that students who look identical on the surface may be quite different if one were to be pushed a little bit more. We try to address this just by asking more questions in our test, but it's remains a concern in the current design of the tool. But there's a lot of faculty support of SLUPE. There's a lot of ownership of the test because a lot of us have spent a lot of time looking at the various curricula in our department, looking at our students, looking at what they know, considering the kinds of students that we get in, the kinds of previous learning experiences our students have had as they enter SLUPE. I want to show you a quick kind of demo of the admin interface. So bear with me 1 second while I change the sharing. Let's see here. Okay. So we're gonna log in as a just to give you an idea of what you see as a new time SLUPE user. We'll go ahead and use an English example. When you first get a SLUPE account, by default, you have no questions in your test. Ideally, you would design your own placement test from scratch. But the interface is very simple. I'm going to show you an example of adding a multiple choice item. So the idea is that you would have some kind of text prompt here, but you can add images, you can add other media here. So for example, the man, very, very tall. Something like this. Although, I'll just do very tall. And then you enter your possible answers. So we're thinking of the verb to be, am, is, are, be. Which of the following answers is correct? The man is. And here's the hard part, actually. It's you decide when in your language curriculum does the incoming student or does the actual student learn this or master this? And so you choose on a scale of 1 through 4, semester 1, which might be, English 101, however you have this set up. Maybe it's a more advanced question, and you add the question. And that's it. You can add another multiple choice question. You go back to the bank, and you slowly build up your test. The same is true for multimedia. You would add a multimedia question. You can upload an audio file here. You would enter 5 true or false statements, select true or false, and then again, decide when in your curriculum is this question largely answerable. Now, once you actually get enough questions in here, you see a slightly different interface. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what I see for our account. We'll do French here. And you'll see here, multiple choice questions. We have 219 questions that we have written and are using for multiple choice. Excuse me. And almost 30 multimedia questions. To give you an idea of the multimedia questions, you see a link to the file, which is an MP3 or an MP4 video file. The student would see something like this when taking the test. And then they would select which ones correspond. So once you have the minimum number of multiple choice and multimedia files, which is 10 per level and for the multiple choice and 3 for multimedia, you'll get a special link that's unique to you, the language in your institution that you'll share with your students. We got an extra microphone on. And then again, searching for test scores is very simple. You put in the email address of the student. We'll do me, and let's try to find a good example here. So if we look at this one, you see that I was doing the French test. Semester 1, I had 100%. Semester 2, 100. Semester 3, I didn't do so well, 67, but it was right at the threshold. 65 is the threshold to be placed in the next level. And I got placement into semester 4. And I must have not done my listening comprehension questions for that particular one. You can see I've taken this test a few times in many different languages. So that's the bulk of the interface to get started. There's other things you can do. For example, when we were looking at the data of how well these questions have been answered, we'll take one of these reading comprehension questions as an example. For any question where you have data, you can look at the stats and you can kind of get a sense at what point the question becomes answerable in your curriculum. So if we look over here, we see that, for the semester 1 students aren't really getting it. The semester 2 students aren't really getting it. But in semester 3, they're starting to get it. And semester 4, they've all got it. So you can look for any individual item because students will, during the calibration process, students will actually select their enrollment. So you can get data like this. And you could just see up here, we have different filters for different semesters, depending when you do the calibration. Other kind of interesting things to look at here, in your account information, or sorry, one thing that might not have been clear is you can set how many questions each student see. So for multiple choice, you can set this lower than 47. 47 is the max, because if we look at the question overview, I only have 47 first semester questions. So whatever the smallest amount is will limit to how many questions you can ask. Most of our tests are 50 questions, and we have 50 multiple choice in each level, and the test will adapt up and down as the student takes the test. Okay, I'm going to switch back to my PowerPoint here in a second. Let's see here. Screen. Let's try this again. Okay, so just some quick information before I get to the questions. Excuse me. SLUPE is free for colleges and universities if you want to build your own test. And again, you don't have to write your own questions. There's a functionality we can talk about where you can look at what other institutions have written and you can tag those questions for yourself. Right now, account creation is limited to language, LLC, LRC faculty affiliated with these institutions, the colleges, universities, to kind of control what gets put into the collective shared database. Because this is free, because we don't have really a staff, other than me and a couple of work study students, there's really limited technical support right now. But you're always free to answer me. I've answered every question so far I've received. So, but it's not a big operation. So I'll fix bugs as they're brought to my attention. But there's just want to say this caveat that you're not going to have the same kind of support you might get from a more commercial operation. And just another technical note is that if you have a large video file or a large audio file, we ask that you host those on your server. If it's a small audio file, we'll host it on our server. My info is here, but I see that there's quite a few questions. So I'm going to take a look over in the chat here. Let's see. The mention of Vietnamese got us very excited. That's great to hear. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so from Daniel Myers, if I didn't answer that, so generally, I mean, you can get by with 40 multiple choice questions and 12 multimedia questions. But my experience is it's not really enough it's enough to make the tool actually run. You'll be provided the link and your students can take the test. But like I said earlier, we found that 50 multiple choice questions in each level that we're testing for is really where we hit the sweet spot. No, we haven't, from Catherine Murphy-Judy, we haven't actually done any kind of talk aloud review with students, although that's a really interesting research project. Maybe something for the future. So and then Jeff asks, is the multiple choice multimedia formatting difference, or are they weighted differently? They're actually weighted differently. So multiple choice is what kind of decides the placement of the student. And then the multimedia is kind of additional information for us. So the students will see a multimedia level video or audio based on however well they did with multiple choice. And what that tells us is like, okay, so this was a third semester student with very poor or very good listening comprehension at that level. So that's a good question. Oh, hey, Jack. Jack asks, minimum number of question items is 52. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Are students required to register, or do you enter their email? So students, they register, and I'll give you, let's see. Yeah, students register. We collect very little information about the students for many reasons. So we will collect their first and last name and their email address. So that's really the only kind of sensitive information that we have on our side. Let's see, Jack offered some clarifications here. If faculty find criteria was not helpful as an indicator of placement, what is your advice to work with faculty in creating appropriate questions for each level? Wow, that is a great question. So What we did was I met with each of our language programs after they kind of put their initial run based on their intuition, because you have to start somewhere. So all of our faculty started with what they intuitively thought would be appropriate questions for that level. Now, some of these, when we were looking at the data, some of them were quite obvious to us, like with hindsight. We're like, oh, you know what? Of course they don't know this. Like, even our graduate students make this mistake. So some of them were really easy to weed out. Some of them, they took some more work or kind of a deeper understanding. But I individually met with them. We talked a lot of SLA theory with the faculty, which isn't necessarily their areas of expertise. So, like for example, you know, in some of these things that we're trying to test, if you have like a Spanish 101 construction like me gusta, right? So one of the things we found was like, yeah, they can use the me gusta very well, but just because they can do like me gusta, you know, whatever, me gusta tequila, doesn't necessarily mean that they can use that in other conjugations. So where we might have the present tense of a verb like that in 101 with the me construction, in 102 or mid-intermediate class, we might change it to le gusta or a different tense. So there are some guidelines proposed by researchers who do the literature on this, you know, and I do provide kind of a bullet point set of basic guidelines before they start, including things like don't include, like, you know, answers A and C or none of the above or all the above. These are generally frowned upon by people in the testing literature. But I do give them something before they start. But really, everything comes down to looking at the data, because the data paints a picture that's often surprising. In addition to what is kind of explicitly taught and learned, a lot of things are implicitly picked up. It's just part of language acquisition. So the SLUPE, you know, we try to measure for both. Daniel Myers asks, is the SLUPE ADA compliant? No, but this question has come up multiple times in the past, and I'd be interested in talking with someone, working with someone to see how many changes would be required to get it to be compliant. I will definitely post my email address again. Is it possible to export data? Yeah, you can export data on a pretty granular level. There's standard Excel data exports. They're CSV, comma separated value sheets, but it's with an Excel extension. And you can definitely do kind of extensive data analysis on your own if you want to work with a statistician, which is ideal if you have one handy. I know not everyone does, which is why some of those statistical tools are already cooked into SLUPE. Let's see, moving on. Valeria asks, can the exam be timed? Right now, the exam's not timed. There's no timing to it. However, if you look at the granular data, each question is time stamped. So you can see kind of after the fact how many students took the test. From BDear9, question, how does the program determine when to pull questions from a different level? Basically, there's a 65% threshold. And there's some other kind of spooky math that goes in there. But like a typical student, you know, they might be presented with 3 101 questions. And if they exceeded the 65% threshold, they'd be prompted with the next level. And every time a student gets a question wrong at a level, they go back down to the previous level until they, again, go back up. Can the system email the students with the results? Absolutely. There's a self kind of retrieval mechanism that students can use to get their own scores emailed. Maria asks, do you gather information about student experience after taking the test? Student experience. We do. There's well, in a way, we don't generally ask them like, hey, did you enjoy that? But we actually use the SLUPE as a tool for our tutors. SLUPE, there's a way to include like codes for each question item and say like, okay, the code would be like subjunctive. And so what we can do is we can auto-generate reports for students who come to our LRC for tutoring, and we say, hey, take the placement test. Let's see where your let's see where your weaknesses are, and let's find some resources to help you. So I don't know if that answers your question, but we definitely talk about the results and about the things that they miss, especially in a tutoring kind of context. Catherine asks, it handles non-Roman writing systems. Absolutely, it's fully UTF-8 compliant. So, you know, if you want to do Arabic or Mandarin, we have a Mandarin test that we use with SLUPE. So non-Roman, no problem. Again, UTF-8, fully UTF-8 compliant. Syed asks, can students record their answer orally? Not right now. I do have another software project that focuses just on oral pronunciation. I'll try to leave a link in before I go. Data export, great. Beth asks, so listening, speaking, and free-form writing are not included any way in the level placement. That is correct. Have you had instructors design content-based questions? Content-based questions. We do have small reading comprehension questions that are often kind of culturally themed. Syed mentions, I don't see Urdu in the language list. It can definitely be used for Urdu, no problem. If I can add Urdu to the list, or you'll see below the language choices that there's a custom 1, custom 2, custom 3, custom 4. So you can just choose the custom 1, custom 2. Can longer text or images be added in the item prompt? Yep, absolutely. There's a massive character limit. I think it's probably 5,000 or maybe 10,000 characters. So no problem with that. From Elos. Let's see, Maria. Yes, students won't like the testing anyways, but I mean in terms of platform performance. Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So one of the main complaints, besides like some of the glitches and bugs we've been working out over the years, is that the multimedia right now is Flash-based. So students taking the test like on an iPad or an iPhone or any kind of iDevice, mobile iDevice, they actually can't see or hear the multimedia questions right now. So that's something we are working on. Right now I'm working on in another version to make the test more HTML5 compliant for those kinds of devices. Moving along, BDR 9, just to clarify, how is correct placement decided? So if a student's placed in the next level, if a student gets more than 65%, right. So for example, you know, a student might, in this level 1, might get 100%, and level 2, they might get 64%, and they'll be placed into level 2. That's how that works. Evos asks if items can be mass imported. There's no import function right now. So if you have like a Excel spreadsheet and you wanted to mass import items, there's no way to do that right now. Maybe you have a work study student who could do that for you. No, that's my solution to everything. But there is kind of a shortcut built into SLUPE, and it's called the build test function. So if, for example, you want to have a French placement test, and you just want to populate your test with what everyone else has already contributed to date, you can do that through the build test function, and it will basically copy every French multiple choice question and multimedia question from all the existing French ones that are in the database. So you'll get a bunch from SLUPE. I know you'll get some from other institutions. But if you do the kind of build test function, you really need to look at all the questions that are in your tests. You'd have to carefully review them after the import to make sure that they actually correspond to what you had in mind for your class. But that's a good idea for the mass import. I'm actually going to make a note of that and think about maybe if we can do some kind of Excel import for the future. Okay, so yeah, we don't do any kind of browser lockdown for our placement tests. We actually don't proctor them at all. A lot of our students will take it in the summer at their homes. And I mean, you know, some students, you know, it's kind of a, I don't want to say it's a low stakes test, but students would get very little benefit in the context at our university if they were to purposely cheat, either do too well or do too poorly on the placement test. So we just, that's not something that we do right here. It would certainly work with a browser lockdown if you were to whitelist the slu.edu domain. Do all exams created automatically become available to all institutions using SLUPE? All the questions are available. So you can browse. So for example, if you are at your institution, like if you create a Portuguese test, and I would be able to see what kinds of questions you contributed into the database. The database is public. So there's no way right now to mark your questions as private. It's kind of think of it maybe like writing a Wikipedia article that everyone can see it, right? Well, maybe that's a bad example because everyone can see it, but if they want to use it, they create their own copy and they edit their own copy. From C Bravo. Does the test function from within an LMS? Not right now. We do have a way to use Moodle to our Moodle integration is kind of primitive in the sense that you could use it to verify who the student is taking the test, but then our results aren't set back to Moodle. They would stay on our server. And we don't have any Blackboard support right now, or Canvas. Right now, the threshold level percentage for item selection, it's not changeable right now. And there's a long explanation for that, but the short explanation is no, that's not changeable at this moment. Again, from BDR9, the technical problems, like I mentioned, for the iOS devices, students without Flash on their computers, students who have disabled JavaScript or have disabled cookies are at risk of experiencing some questions not display properly or maybe get kicked out of the test early. We're working on a solution for that as well. Syed asks again, can it be used as a performance or achievement test at the end of every month or semester? Yeah, this is absolutely what we do. This is part of our core assessment that we do. It's kind of, you know, it's perhaps a more objective measure of how students are progressing. And we can share that history too with the students to see like, okay, here's how you did beginning of the semester, here's how you did at the end of the semester. And some of them are excited to see that. It's kind of interesting, but we use it for internally for assessment purposes. We also use it to see like, hey, how come these second semester kids keep messing up these fundamental things. Maybe we need to spend more time on that. Moving along from D. Cohen, have institutions imported their current placement exams into SLUPE? So as long as items have been identified according to course levels. I'm not sure I understand your question. Could you rephrase that for me, please? Maria, do you provide a browser reviewer for students to know if they're missing plugging before taking this? Yes, we do, absolutely. The first thing every student sees is a little flash test before they take the test, so they'll know whether or not they're going to be able to listen to or view the audio or video.
Dan, that is so cool, and so much work that you put into that. Thanks so much for sharing with us, your tool and how you're using it. If there are any last questions, please type them in the chat. And I think, Dan, you said you would type in your email and the link to your other project.
Yeah.
More questions are going to appear too.
I'm going to type in my email right now one more time. And the other one, if you're interested in using measuring or evaluating student speech, there's something for you to look at as well. Back to, I see Jeff's got another question. If we were to look at the item data, would it only be the data for the items used at our institution? Yes, absolutely. It would not include any data collected at other institutions for example, how often a question was missed or answered correctly. It will only be specific to you. Okay, D. Cohen's trying to reformulate this question for me. If a current exam places students according to percentage right, could we identify the level and then import into SLUPE? Oh man, I'm struggling with this. Yes, I mean you could. So if you have some kind of, I don't know, end of semester test that has questions that correspond to your student population and curriculum, you could absolutely reuse those questions. You might have to formulate them a little bit differently to be 4-question multiple choice. There's not a whole lot I can do about that to keep the tests from keep it so all the questions are corrected and graded automatically. But yeah, absolutely. So how do students see the results? They see the results right when they're done, instantly. And so they get it, and it's stored on the server, so faculty can access it the second that it's done. They can actually look at tests that are in progress as well. Yes, Matt, that sounds good. Oh yeah, about Washbag testing, Washbag. So the one thing I didn't mention is, we have like for the French test, I said I have 50 questions per level, but they are selected randomly, and I think the chances of statistically, the chances of a student seeing the same test, assuming they've made some progress from seeing the same test, it's statistically very unlikely that they would see the same test. They would see some of the same question items, and whether or not that they remember them, they wouldn't necessarily know whether or not they got the question right or wrong, because they don't get that feedback. They don't get the feedback on the individual items. But we do have some students who, they'll sit down and they'll take the test, maybe one day, then the next day, for whatever reason. This has happened in the past, and sometimes the scores are a little bit different in their favor. Do you mind clarifying your stepping rule? I mean, the procedure of going higher and lower. So basically, it's kind of, I'm going to try to make it as simple as I can. To say move beyond like the 101 level, you need to at least have answered so many questions right? Just a number of questions right. and not only answered that many number of questions right, but also at a certain percentage, which is 65%. And that rule is repeated for each subsequent level. So if I'm like, you know, at the third semester level, and I get prompted with a fourth semester question and I get it wrong, I'll go back down to the third semester level, even though that percentage is above 65 overall. I hope that makes sense. From Maria, what did the faculty think overall about the test? Like I said, there's a lot of kind of a sense of ownership of the test. And we were in a really bad situation when I decided to design the test with re-registrations and just poor placement. So it's been largely positive. I think some of the faculty maybe didn't realize that it was going to be a lot of work to create our own assessment. And also there's a sense, there was a sense from some faculty members, I needed to get some extra buy-in because, you know, I would suggest removing an item from a language curriculum for a language that I didn't speak based on the data, saying like, hey, I know this is in your curriculum. I know that you teach this in, you know, Russian, you know, 102, but your students across the board don't answer it right. So let's either reformulate the question or let's take it out. So getting faculty buy-in to understand the role of a data-driven placement test and to let them know like, hey, this isn't meant to be your final exam for this class. This has a different purpose. We have another maybe clarification question from BDear9. I understand the questions created in our institution are available to everyone. How about the tests we put together from other questions? No, there's no real way to just copy over, like say like, hey, I just want the SLUE test, question for question. That's not really factored into how the tool is set up right now. Yeah, and Maria asked another question that gets brought up with some frequency. It's about heritage speakers and placement testing. I think ultimately you need a different assessment tool or a different set of questions for the heritage speakers. I don't think you can use the same question set. And one way you can do this with SLUPE is like if you wanted 2 Spanish tests, for example. So for one of them, you could use the one that says Spanish. And then for your heritage speakers, select one of the custom options like custom 1, custom 2, and use that for the heritage speakers and for developing that test, because you're going to have a totally different question set. So from D. Cohen about how do students access it. Students access it through a URL. You send them a link, and that link is unique to your institution and the language that you're testing. So it's as easy as posting the link on your website, or emailing the link, or having your LRC staff take the students to the link. Again, let's see, Maria says it's designed for learners. Okay. Awesome. Has any validation research been conducted or planned? Yeah. My whole dissertation was on a longitudinal study using SLUPE. And there's some, I don't know, yeah, Jack's in the chat room. He has got some scholarly articles about research. I don't know, Jack, if you could share those links if you have them handy. I also have those links on the test website. So let me share that with you again. Thanks, Jack. Appreciate it. And Maria says, did you base it on ACTFL standards? Not originally, but in the time since, our department's changed a lot of our learning outcomes to be ACTFL based, and we have done some revision to the test, some of the test items in our tests from that change in our department. Yeah, and Jack, yeah, I forgot. He's got 2 articles. So thanks for that.
Well, again, thank you so much, Dan, for sharing your experience and sharing your tool. I can't imagine how much work you've put into that.
I don't want to think about it.
And so everyone can check it out at your SLUPE website, right? And I just want to say to everyone that we are recording this webinar, and if you're an IALLT member, you can, once we post it, you can go and check out the webinar again if you missed something or need to recall something. And I just want to tell everyone about our webinar that's coming up next month. We have one every month, and everyone is invited, so please let your colleagues know. The one in July will be July 12th at 2 p.m. Automated and Intelligent Tools in the Language Classroom by Greg Kessler from Ohio University. So we really appreciate that you, especially Dan, that you, when I said, would you do it on placement testing, you said yes. Thank you so much.
No problem. And I will also be at the conference this summer in a few weeks. So if anybody wants to chat about placement testing or SLUPE, I'll be there. I'll be more happy to talk to you.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Thanks.